Katharine Schwab. I'm a senior editor at Forbes covering technology. Today we launched the Midas List, which is the top 100 venture capital investors in the world. I'm really excited to be here with Alex Konrad, the editor of the list. Alex, can you tell me about what is Midas? How do we rank the top 100 investors in the world?
Of course. Thanks, Katharine. So we've been doing the Midas List of Forbes for 22 years, since 2000, with 1 year off in the previous financial crisis. And the Midas List is a definitive data-driven list that takes hundreds of partners and VC firms' data over all the years, as well as publicly available data sources, and comes up with a ranking of an investor based off of their portfolio. So we're talking the leading private companies that have a high valuation, and then also those companies that have exited that have either been acquired or gone public via IPO.
Okay, so we launched this list today. What are the biggest takeaways for you covering venture capital when you look at this year's list?
Katharine, I think of this year's Midas List as sort of like the revenge of the old investors with IPOs, kind of the second movie in the trilogy. We saw a lot of new faces last year. We had a new number one last year who was a crypto investor. And this year, a lot of those faces have moved down or moved off the list. And you're seeing some old faces return back at the top, and also some investors return to the list who had been on in previous years. And I think the reason you're seeing that is there just aren't any IPOs happening. You know, we're seeing valuations drop. Stripe a year ago was a $100 billion valuation. This year, it was down to 50. Similarly, across the board, you're seeing crypto, fintech, unicorns not worth as much as they were. So what does that do? That moves up the IPOs. So we're seeing investors in companies like Airbnb and DoorDash and Snowflake and Enterprise, all doing really well on the list.
Okay, so you said that we had a new top slot last year with a crypto investor. Who's in the top slot this year?
So a investor who's kind of considered the leading face of venture capital in China, named Shen, is back at number one on this year's list. Neil actually had a multi-year run at the top of the list before the recent kind of bull run that ended last year. After 2 years no longer in the top slot, he's back at number one because of a bunch of Chinese IPOs and also ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok.
Okay, so why is ByteDance such a big deal for Neil's investment portfolio?
ByteDance is, by all accounts, the most valuable startup in the world. It traded at twice what it did on the secondary markets 2 years ago, but even at $220 billion, that's $80 billion more than the next most valuable startup in the world, which is Elon Musk's SpaceX. So anyone who's an investor in ByteDance is going to see a big boost on the Midas List unless they invested very recently at one of those super high price tags. Now, I want to caution that the Midas List does value private companies less than it does a public exit, because cash in hand from an IPO or a sale is going to be worth more to a venture capitalist than paper gains that haven't actually translated yet. But you just can't ignore $220 billion. And so ByteDance is still the biggest driver on this list and put a few other investors on the list as well.
Okay, but ByteDance is also a somewhat controversial company. There's a lot of talk right now, and there has been for years, about the role of the Chinese government's influence over the company, specifically with TikTok, which is hugely popular here. 150 million Americans have it on their phones. How does that complicate what venture capitalists can expect when looking at an exit with ByteDance?
It's a great question, and it's one that I was really thinking about as we put together this year's list, so much so that I decided to try to ask all the investors on the Midas List who are in ByteDance what they thought about this situation. None of them wanted to talk on the record for our story. However, in talking to sources and experts in the secondary markets, as well as analysts, I got the sense that ByteDance is sort of this fascinating Schrodinger's exit. It's almost like imagine a big pot of gold that's on the edge of the horizon for these VCs, but it might be a mirage. You don't really know because they can't actually necessarily have it back just yet. So, a company that does 80 billion in revenue in a year and is still private is going to be a really big company on the public markets. And if you were an early investor in a company like that, you're sitting on billions, if not tens of billions of dollars in profits, but you can't take it out. It's just sitting there. And so that was the fascinating thing about this story and about ByteDance's impact on the Midas List this year is for these 6 investors and others, we're talking career-making, career-defining outcomes when it happens. But right now, they just got to wait. It's not happening. It could be 12 months. It could be 18 months. The main thing that we've heard is that these investors just want clarity. Because even if TikTok went to zero and ByteDance, just the China business, went public in Hong Kong, that's still a huge company from a venture capital standpoint. Of course, it'd be even better if TikTok could continue to operate, or if it was split in 2, and maybe these VCs could somehow get 2 IPOs out of it. That would be even more money for them. So from a purely capitalistic standpoint, this is a massive, massive outcome that is just out of reach.
So ByteDance was really big for several investors who've been on the list over and over again. What about newcomers to the list this year? What's putting them on the Midas list? And are there any faces you want to highlight?
Yeah, so we had 12 people back on the list this year who were either newcomers or returnees. That's a lot less than in the past because we haven't seen those huge IPOs or new outcomes that were, putting surprise faces. That said, there have been a couple of really interesting faces to join the list. So, one of my colleagues wrote a great story about Lauren Kolodny, a partner at a firm called Acrew Capital. Her co-founder, Teresa Gao, has been on the Midas list many years in the past, as well as atop our self-made women list. Lauren is part of a new generation of investors in a bunch of cool companies like Chime, a fintech unicorn. And so she's appearing on the list as a newcomer who's a woman investor. And then we also saw our first ever Black investor on the Midas list this year, Adeyemi Ade Ajao, who's the founder of Base 10 Partners. Ade is a really interesting story. He founded Facebook for Spain and sold it, and then came to the Bay Area, wanted to go to Stanford for business school, wanted to get into the startup game on the West Coast. He ended up being involved in the founding story of a couple Latin American unicorns and was an early investor in Nubank, which is a massive neobank in South America. Now Ade is investing in Africa and other places, and Base 10 has established itself as a serious player in the Bay Area ecosystem.
So you said he is the first Black investor ever on the list, which is historic. We are definitely going to be doing some more coverage of his work at Forbes. What does the list look like from a diversity standpoint in general, and how does that play into the rankings?
I've run the Midas list for Forbes for about a decade, and the diversity and inclusion side of the list has always provoked a mixed reaction for me. On the one hand, because Midas is a data-driven list that looks at your past portfolio, sometimes investments you've made a decade ago, we're not going to see as fast progress there as we might on, let's say, our 30 under 30 list, where about half of venture capitalists come from an underrepresented background. So on Midas, you aren't seeing necessarily the progress that we would hope from the industry. We have 11 women on this year's list, which is the same as last year, one off our all-time high. 12% doesn't look that great. Unfortunately, it's also ahead of the industry average for women in general partner positions in venture capital firms. So, we're seeing a little progress there, but we would love to see a lot more. I think if you want to see some of the up-and-comers who we think will make the Midas list in the future, who might represent where things are hopefully going, you can check out our Midas Brink list, which is published with our partner, TrueBridge Capital Partners. That shows kind of up-and-comers or people whose track records are getting there and are people that we think will make the list. I think you'll see a little more diversity on that list, but it is frustrating to be celebrating our first Black investor on the list ever. Frankly, we would like to see a future where that is a non-story.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the kind of general economic climate right now, what do you think this year's list says about the challenges that tech companies and startups are experiencing right now?
I think the Midas list reflects a wider reckoning across the tech sector of a flight to quality, a flight to substance. I think when deals aren't as frequent, you're seeing venture capitalists podcasting and posting memes on Twitter and kind of doing the sort of more marketing side of the job. But the reality is a lot of these folks on the Midas list are not necessarily the most popular on social media, but they were really early investors in these companies that actually went public and created value, like an Airbnb. Someone like Alfred Lin from Sequoia, who was an investor in Airbnb and DoorDash, but, has kind of famously kept a slightly lower profile compared to some of the people in his life, like, Tony Hsieh, the Zappos co-founder, who our colleagues recently wrote a great book about. Alfred is a secondary figure in that story as a former Zappos executive and friend of Tony's who's avoided the limelight. He's kind of that classic Midas investor who, in this moment, does really well on the list because he just sort of quietly backs these companies that go public. I think if I'm an entrepreneur looking at the Midas list, that's a reminder that at the end of the day, what venture capital really needs is money back. Just a big shiny valuation is not the end goal for anybody, and frankly, as we see some of these valuations dropping, that's causing really tough situations at these startups, layoffs, budgets tightening. And so I think it's a sober moment in the tech industry. And I think the Midas list, unfortunately or not, based on your vantage point, is reflecting that moment as well.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. It was great to have you.
Oh, of course. Thanks, Katharine.